Stop everything for a second, because what unfolded inside the world of Kandi Burruss and Todd Tucker wasn't loud, explosive, or chaotic the way reality television has trained us to expect. There were no viral shouting matches, no furniture-throwing confrontations, no dramatic exits captured by a Bravo camera crew on The Real Housewives of Atlanta. Instead, what allegedly happened behind closed doors was far more subtle, and according to Riley Burruss, far more intentional. For years, the public consumed an image of stability, a blended family navigating business, parenting, and fame with confidence. But Riley now paints a very different picture, one not of sudden collapse, but of slow, calculated reordering. And once you hear it through that lens, the smiles start to look different, the milestones start to feel strategic, and the silence becomes deafening. From the outside, Kandi and Todd looked like the blueprint for a modern power couple. She was already a respected artist and entrepreneur long before reality television, building a brand that extended beyond music into restaurants, stage productions, and multiple business ventures. He was introduced as the supportive husband, the producer with ambition, the steady presence who seemed comfortable in her spotlight. Together, they presented a blended family that felt aspirational. Holidays looked warm, birthdays looked extravagant, social media showed unity. Their household appeared structured yet loving, ambitious yet emotionally connected. But Riley suggests that what the public saw was only the curated version. She describes a home where presentation mattered deeply, where unity was displayed but alignment wasn't always organic. The laughter was real, perhaps, the smiles were genuine in the moment, but beneath that surface, she claims, dynamics were shifting in ways that weren't immediately obvious. There weren't explosive fights echoing down hallways, there weren't public breakdowns. Instead, there was evaluation, observation, quiet positioning, a household that operated less on emotional spontaneity and more on controlled response. And that's what makes the story unsettling, because chaos is easy to spot, strategy isn't. One of the most striking aspects of Riley's account is her description of affection being measured. She doesn't describe outright cruelty, she doesn't claim dramatic mistreatment. Instead, she talks about subtle calibration, about approval being tied to performance. In her telling, love wasn't necessarily withdrawn, but it felt conditional. She and her sister often felt evaluated, as though their choices were being silently scored. Academic success, public behavior, independence, everything carried weight. Meanwhile, Todd's biological daughter, Kayla Tucker, occupied a different position in the household structure. Riley claims Kayla was protected from the intensity that she and her sister experienced, shielded from the same scrutiny, empowered without the same pressure. And while that difference might seem natural in blended families navigating complex loyalties, Riley describes it as systemic rather than circumstantial. The difference wasn't loud, it was gradual. It showed up in tone, in reaction, in what was excused versus what was corrected. And then came the Porsche. When Todd gifted Kayla a Porsche, the public saw a proud father celebrating his daughter with a lavish surprise. In celebrity culture, extravagant gifts are practically expected. But Riley says the car wasn't just a gift, it was a message. To her, it symbolized positioning. It reinforced who was protected, who was celebrated without caveat, and who lived under layered expectations. The issue wasn't materialism, it wasn't jealousy over a luxury vehicle. It was what the moment represented after years of subtle differentiation. Riley describes that gift as the detonator, not because it created favoritism, but because it exposed what she felt had always been there. It crystallized unspoken hierarchies. It turned internal discomfort into undeniable clarity. Suddenly, small gestures from the past seemed to align into a pattern. Birthdays, praise, public acknowledgement, private correction, everything took on new meaning. And once someone sees a pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. Riley's story becomes even more layered when she explains that this wasn't necessarily about good versus bad, it was about philosophy. Todd, in her view, operated from an outcome-driven mindset. Toughness builds resilience, pressure produces excellence, accountability sharpens character. It's a mindset many parents believe prepares children for the real world. Kandi, on the other hand, has long emphasized emotional intelligence, independence, and nurturing strength. She built her career through perseverance and creative control, and she often speaks publicly about protecting her children's individuality. Riley suggests that instead of these two philosophies balancing one another, they clashed in subtle ways that created division. Where one saw preparation, the other felt pressure. Where one saw structure, the other felt scrutiny. In many households, differing parenting styles coexist, but in a home already layered with fame, business interests, and public visibility, those differences can magnify. Riley describes living in an environment where rules felt unwritten yet constantly enforced, where the emotional temperature shifted based on performance rather than connection.
What makes this narrative particularly haunting is that the unraveling wasn't dramatic. As tensions increased, Todd didn't erupt. He didn't publicly condemn. According to Riley, he retreated. Conversations shortened. Physical presence diminished. Business trips became more frequent. Emotional investment felt diluted. As he split time between Atlanta and New York, the distance wasn't just geographical, it was relational. Riley describes the shift as almost imperceptible at first, like watching a tide slowly pull back. You don't notice it moment by moment, but eventually the shoreline looks completely different. The absence became louder than arguments ever could have been, and inside that vacuum, power shifted. In a family whose life unfolded partially online, social media became its own coded language. Riley observed how posts changed, how certain images disappeared, how captions became more curated. Public unity continued, but she claims subtle absences spoke volumes. In celebrity culture, silence is often strategic. Deleting a photo can say more than a press release. Not appearing at an event can communicate alignment shifts without confrontation. Riley suggests that while the public saw continuity, those inside the household recognized realignment. Emotional labor, she says, became transactional. Every interaction carried subtext. Every silence signaled positioning. The home that once felt warm began to feel operational. When the marriage officially ended, many expected spectacle. Reality television conditions audiences to anticipate explosive finales, but this wasn't that. According to Riley, the final phase wasn't confrontation, it was disappearance. Todd didn't dramatically exit, he reduced presence until it was nearly gone. Delayed responses, hollow explanations, eventually absence. And in that absence, Riley says, everything became clear. The system hadn't collapsed, it had reorganized. Influence shifted, authority dissolved, the hierarchy adjusted. The family didn't shatter in one loud moment, it was quietly dismantled over time. Riley's revelations challenged the public narrative that this was simply another celebrity divorce. She frames it as something more structural, not a story of love lost, but of influence repositioned, of roles reassigned, of a household strategically reordered long before paperwork was filed.
However, when America looked at Kandi and Todd, especially through the lens of the Real Housewives of Atlanta, they didn't just see a couple. They saw an empire. They saw a partnership that blended love, business, and parenting into something aspirational. They saw proof that success didn't have to cost stability. But Riley now says what viewers were really watching was a performance. And behind that performance, something much quieter was unfolding. A slow dismantling that didn't scream, it reorganized. For over a decade, the narrative felt airtight. Kandi was already a powerhouse long before reality television, a Grammy-winning songwriter, entrepreneur, and cultural force. Todd entered her world publicly as steady, composed, strategic. Together, they projected discipline and devotion. Their businesses expanded, their restaurants thrived, their family blended on screen in ways that felt modern and mature.
Fans pointed to them as evidence that love could thrive under pressure, that ambition didn't have to fracture intimacy. But Riley says what looked solid wasn't solid, it was structured. And she draws a sharp distinction between those two words. Structure can look impressive from the outside, it can be symmetrical, it can be organized, it can even function efficiently. But stability requires something else: emotional alignment, shared philosophy, consistent safety. According to Riley, that's where the cracks began forming long before anyone noticed. She describes a home that didn't implode in dramatic fights, it eroded, slowly, quietly, with conversations that felt more like negotiations than connection, with disagreements that weren't explosive but were persistent. And at the center of that erosion, she says, were two completely different philosophies on how to raise children. Riley describes her mother as someone who believed deeply in emotional security. Kandi wanted her daughters to know they were loved unconditionally, not for performance, not for perfection, not for resilience, but simply because they were hers. Home, in Kandi's view, was supposed to be the place where you didn't have to earn affection. Todd, according to Riley, approached parenting from a different angle. He believed in preparation, toughness, accountability. He wanted children who could survive without anyone's protection, who understood that the world would not soften itself for them. In isolation, neither philosophy sounds harmful. In fact, both can be valuable. But Riley says inside one household, those philosophies didn't balance, they collided. Every decision became layered, not just, is this right, but what kind of adult are we trying to build? When she struggled emotionally, she says, one parent offered comfort while the other offered correction. When she asserted independence, one parent saw growth while the other saw defiance. And over time, she began to feel not nurtured, but evaluated. She describes affection not as absent, but as conditional, support not as automatic, but as earned. The language of the home shifted from warmth to performance metrics, and she says that shift changed everything. One of the most painful parts of Riley's account is not dramatic conflict, it's labeling. She says she felt categorized, spoiled, soft, dependent, words that carried weight in conversations she wasn't present for, words that followed her into decisions she didn't participate in. She describes Todd's style as managerial, not cruel, but corporate. Compliments felt scarce, critiques felt constant. Independence was praised, but only when it aligned with a specific definition of strength. Meanwhile, Todd's biological daughter, Kayla Tucker, existed within the same house under what Riley perceived as a different framework. Riley says Kayla had rules, but she also had protection from certain types of scrutiny. Whether that perception was mutual or misaligned didn't matter. What mattered, Riley says, was how it felt, and feelings inside a home shape identity. Slowly, she says, survival replaced sisterhood, not because they hated each other, but because they were navigating two standards under one roof. Riley believed Kayla was shielded by Todd's philosophy. Kayla, she claims, believed Riley was shielded by Kandi's influence and wealth. Once those beliefs hardened, silence set in, and silence inside a family can be louder than any argument. Then came the moment Riley says clarified everything: the Porsche. To the public, it looked like a generous milestone gift, a proud parent moment, a celebration. But inside the house, Riley says, it landed differently, not because of material value, but because of symbolism. She perceived it as reinforcement of positioning, as validation of one standard over another. That night, she claims, the energy shifted, tone sharpened, conversations turned political. She says a comment was made about her not understanding what it meant to earn something, a remark that cut deeper than intended. Whether meant as motivation or criticism, Riley says it felt like confirmation of every insecurity she had been quietly carrying. Then came a social media post, something implying that stepchildren never fully become real family. Riley says that sentence didn't just sting, it clarified, because suddenly the philosophical differences felt less theoretical and more personal, less about parenting styles and more about allegiance. From that point forward, she says, the household stopped feeling like a home. It felt like a structure waiting for inevitable collapse.
But collapse didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived as distance. By mid-2025, Riley says the emotional separation had already happened long before any paperwork. Todd wasn't erupting, he was fading. Atlanta, New York, split time, shorter texts, delayed calls, reduced presence. The absence was gradual, but measurable. When Kandi quietly removed Todd's last name from her social media, there was no press release, no public statement. Riley says that subtle deletion spoke louder than any announcement could have. It wasn't branding, it was preparation. And when Todd eventually left physically, Riley says his words weren't heated, they were final. He was done pretending, done maintaining something that no longer felt aligned. But what shocked her most wasn't the departure, it was the reaction. Riley claims that instead of mourning, there was relief. Instead of heartbreak, there was positioning. A message circulated. Finally, he's free. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, Riley says that moment confirmed something she had suspected for years, that the fracture wasn't sudden, it had been building strategically. This wasn't chaos, it was design. And when she began viewing the marriage through that lens, everything looked different. The businesses, the prenup, the subtle alignments. She suggests the divorce wasn't emotional, it was operational. After the separation, Riley says the biggest shift wasn't in headlines, it was in energy. Phones stopped ringing, conversations shortened, support became selective. Discussions shifted from feelings to assets, from reconciliation to leverage. She realized the narrative wasn't being managed emotionally, it was being managed procedurally. Online observers began noticing patterns. Who stopped appearing in familiar spaces? Who remained untouched? Who seemed strategically silent? Riley didn't deny speculation. Instead, she said something that circulated widely. Watch who stays quiet. They're the ones with the most to lose. Then she added another line that reframed everything. We weren't breaking down. We were being phased out. That sentence unsettled people because it implied replacement, and replacement suggests intention. By the time Riley began speaking publicly, her tone wasn't angry, it was precise. She stopped persuading, she started documenting. Old interviews resurfaced, body language was re-examined, jokes were reclassified as warnings. The public shifted from asking who was wrong to asking who benefited. Because random chaos has no architect, strategic change does. Near the end of one conversation, Riley dropped a quiet line. One day, I'll tell the part I'm not ready to say yet. That wasn't an ending, it was a pause, and pauses imply consequence. Riley never named a villain, she described a mechanism, a system that reorganizes rather than explodes, a household that didn't collapse from betrayal, but from ideological warfare, from conditional affection, from positioning disguised as preparation. This story isn't about scandal, it's about systems, about how families can fracture not from a single betrayal, but from accumulated philosophy clashes that slowly harden into division. She describes her years of silence not as passivity, but as observation, documentation, watching patterns form, watching alliances shift, watching warmth drain from spaces that once felt secure. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that the public image remained largely intact until the end. The smiles didn't disappear overnight. The brand didn't crumble publicly. The unraveling was internal. which raises the lingering question Riley leaves hanging in the air. If it was design, whose design was it? In the end, this story forces us to reconsider what we think we see when we watch celebrity families. We assume visibility equals transparency. We assume conflict equals truth. But sometimes, the most profound transformations happen quietly. Riley's account isn't filled with dramatic accusations. It's filled with patterns, with interpretation, with reflection on subtle shifts that accumulated over years. And whether one views her perspective as definitive truth or deeply personal perception, it undeniably reframes the narrative surrounding one reality TV show's most admired couples. Because maybe the most powerful moves aren't loud. Maybe the real story isn't in who shouts, it's in who slowly disappears. And as this chapter closes for Kandi, Todd, and their family, one thing is certain. What the public saw for years may have been real in moments, but it was never the full story. So the next time a reality TV family looks perfectly aligned, perfectly polished, perfectly unbreakable, look closer, because sometimes the silence tells you everything.